Okay, welcome back. I am pleased to be able to have a conversation with my friend and colleague, Dave from Upstart. And Dave and I are going to talk about what Vinod refers to as the entrepreneurial roller coaster, which has certainly been the case the last almost decade.
More. 11 years.
With Upstart. Before Upstart, Dave worked both at Apple and Google, among other places, and it's been a true roller coaster. In some ways, every startup is, but just to give you a sense of some of the aspects in which Upstart's been a true roller coaster, if we just look at the stock price, it started out at 0, and then some initial seed rounds, the early rounds. Then over the last few years, it went up to $390 or so a share, and now is down to 28, which has been quite a lot of ups and downs, but much as it's down, it's still company's worth $2.5 billion, is a public company. And to me, importantly, not only is it worth $2.5 billion, but the cumulative burn in the company's history must be a couple $100 million or something.
No.
Or less.
Actually, cumulatively profitable.
Cumulatively profitable, even better. Because there are companies out there that are worth a couple billion, having burned $8 billion, like say SoFi, but not naming names. So it's been quite a roller coaster, but overall, we're very proud to have been on the journey, and I think it's been managed, well, seemingly masterfully from the outside, but inside the sausage factory, there's lots of blood and guts. So we're here to talk about some of that. So let's start by sharing with people, what does Upstart do?
Yeah, so in short, we are a company about applying AI to lending, and principally consumer lending. And the premise of the company is that credit is a foundational part of our economy. It's pretty much a vital ingredient of everybody's lives. So it is as important, it's one of those hugely important things in the category of health and relationships and family and religion, et cetera. Access to money and how much you pay to borrow money is fundamentally important. And the systems that have been in use for many decades are horrendously inefficient. They approve too few people, they charge too many people too much. And the simple way to look at it is about 90% of interest paid in the world is fundamentally unnecessary. And it's there because there's enormous inefficiencies and inaccuracies in lending. And if you could apply much more sophisticated risk models, you could begin to eat away at that, and the cost of borrowing would go down for almost everybody. And so it's a very simple notion, applying modern data science to a very, very old problem. And that's the heart of what we're doing. The business model we chose was not to become a bank or to do something else, or a hedge fund or something else, but to become what amounts to a marketplace with lenders and credit investors on one side and borrowers on the other. And that's the heart of our business model. But the real core of what the business is more sophisticated ways to originate credit.
Thank you. So let's start with one of the inspirations for this talk is I listened to a podcast that you did, and the interviewer asked you, how did you pick between term sheets as you grew the company? So how did you pick between term sheets, Dave?
Yeah, we always had a rough go of it. I think part of it being on me, I think I was probably better at building a company than I was at raising money for whatever reason. And so when I got asked that question, I was like, wow, I can't believe how many people write blog posts or do podcasts about their approach to deciding between investors. They'll spend time with them. They need to see them in 4 seasons, whatever. They give them stress test questions. I'm like, I chose the only one that wrote a check. Because literally after our seed round, we never had more than a single signable lead term sheet for any round ever. And that was the reality. And I also just thought, why is the whole world feeling like they need to give advice to that 3% of companies who actually don't need any advice? They're in amazing shape, when the 97% of companies were more like us. Like, how do you get a check written for the next round? But in any case, we survived, so that's the good news, but never easy.
So let's talk about lessons learned about how do you get money when it's hard to get money?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you just keep going, and we never raised as much money as we wanted to. If you said, as we started to prepare for any of our funding rounds, we always raised less, just because that was what was available to us. So we were kind of born of starvation. That was a good thing. I mean, when we did our seed round, we made what I think is a very classic mistake of taking seed money from three kind of mainstream all VC funds. And what happened basically was a few months later, or several months later, when it was time to raise our A, they all kind of weren't ready to step up. And we had what is classically known as the signal problem, where every other sort of door on Sand Hill Road or elsewhere would say, you know, well, why aren't they leading this round? And there was not a good answer to that. But anyway, you know, I think just fortuitously always found the right person with the right attitude, which tended to always have to be counter to where everyone else was swimming, because for a lot of reasons we got into a fintech market when it was really hot and we were considered to be kind of too late. And then later, those kind of companies collapsed, and suddenly it was like a very out of fashion, sort of like being in ad tech or something at the wrong time. And so we just always, it didn't really work that way, but we always found the person, I think, that had the unique viewpoint, as David did, as Khosla did, to swim upstream against what I think most of the market was thinking.
Yeah, a couple observations and then a further question on that. One observation is, it's good for us that you only had one offer, because it helped me win the deal. And two is that I find it inspirational that your experience, I think, is not uncommon. It's so much so that I've observed there's almost an inverse relationship between fundraising success and ultimate success as a company. Particularly the overfunded, flashy unicorns often don't end well. And companies that were not unicorns before they went public often end up doing better as a public company. One more question on financing is, any advice for people on things like see lots of investors, or see a couple and keep changing the pitch, or just what ended up working when it was, you know, when you'd see 5 investors and they'd pass, how'd you eventually find one that gets to yes?
Yeah, we got some really good help from early people, like First Round Capital, who I'm a huge fan of, was very helpful to us through the process, helping us evaluate this. I do think you have to do it in a fairly condensed period for kind of obvious reasons. And I do think, kind of, if you want to call it A/B testing, but trying your message, trying to get very quick feedback, and try to get legitimate feedback, because you know, when people say no to you, they will often hide the real reason. So trying to get legitimate feedback so you can be better the next time you're presenting to the next is and some other, you know, there was a real stark difference, I would say, between even the biggest name of venture capitalists out there, the ones who really, even though they said no to us, handled it extremely well, and those that were just, in my mind, just fairly useless in the process. And but you know, getting to the people that will give you great feedback and iterating very quickly on it, I think, is really important. You have to do it all in a very short period of time, because your shelf life as someone raising money, as I think people know, is pretty short.
Let's talk about business plans, success, failure. One thing that I think is a really hard challenge for CEOs is balancing being resilient and persistent versus failing fast and iterating. So what was your experience with that, and what advice do you have about how to know when you should just not quit and keep at it versus change and pivot?
Yeah, so we went through a fairly dramatic pivot about a year into our existence. And up to that point in time, you know, we started with this notion of income share agreements, which is essentially a marketplace, but instead of a loan, you would get money and you would pay it back as a fraction of your future income. It's a fairly out there idea, got a lot of attention. But in any case, so we started down that path, and it was working reasonably well and growing reasonably well. So it wasn't like a clear failure or a clear success. other than it wasn't growing nearly as fast as we had hoped that it would. And I think there's like these two models in Silicon Valley that you always think about. The PayPal story is, they just kept changing business models every 2 months, and they just threw something out, tried this, tried that, until they found something that worked. So the PayPal lens was sort of one way. The other one, though, is the Airbnb lens, where they kind of like just kept polishing and fine-tuning. They didn't change their model at all. They just kept tweaking and tuning. So we were naturally starting down this path of we liked what we were doing. So we were in the Airbnb model, but we didn't really know whether we should be in the PayPal model and tossing things around. And ultimately, did we go fast enough or whatever? I think ultimately the pressure came because we got to a point where we had a certain amount of money left, probably 6 months of money or something. I became pretty convinced that there was not another polish that was going to change the trajectory. We had done it enough, we had looked at it enough, and we felt we had to take the risk of changing course entirely. So it is a really hard thing. I think sometimes you need an outsider to poke at you a bit, and in our case, a board member who basically just asked the very hard questions, and it just caused us to finally say, yep, it's time to change. So unfortunately, there's no easy answer to it, but I think that's the lens that you have to look at this through.
So after you made that change, was it all a downhill battle?
I will say the good thing is, well, the thing if I ever write the book, the part I will leave out is that we kind of hedged. We sort of had this first product, and we layered on a second product. And it took us about 3 months of work to let them coexist and get the second product, which is a straight consumer loan, out in the market. But within a week, we had done as much of the new product as we had the first product in the entire first year and a half. So it became apparent within a matter of days. So I wrote one of these thoughtful blogs that said, oh, we're going to now have 2 products. And then a week later saying, never mind, we're sunsetting that old product. So it was, in the true sense, like a great successful pivot. It was immediately obvious that it was the right decision. For about a year or so, it all went smoothly. And then, for lots of reasons, things went crazy, and we hit all sorts of rocks again. But still, successful pivot and things we got through.
So let's talk some about the hitting the rocks. Because I think a lot of times, just like you were mentioning with the illusion that most startups get multiple term sheets and the challenging part is picking. I think especially when people see a company that's now successful, like yours, it can be hard to relate to what they're going through. So what did you go through? Like, was it easy?
Well, when you're in the world of lending, it's a cyclical business, right? The industry comes and goes, and the availability of funding comes and goes. And so you're just in this place where you're trying to prove something. And proving success is also has a long arc to it, right? I mean, you can't make a loan and say, hey, that was awesome. You have to figure out whether it will be paid back. So there's just a long arc of proving success. It's a very cyclical industry. And honestly, so much of the venture community had just said, we don't do that stuff. For some reason, when it comes to the notion of lending, my sense is like 9 out of 10 venture capitalists just say, there's something going on there and I don't really understand it, and I don't want to put my money behind it. So we had like all those things working against us. And when we got to a place where we were trying to raise money when we couldn't raise money, trying to do an inside round in a pretty ugly situation, it sort of worked out. But it was definitely a case where times got very tough. We never really got to the point where we weren't going to make payroll or anything like that. But definitely a place where that pressure of raising the next round was always there. And but I honestly, looking back at it, I kind of go, yeah, that sort of should have happened. That's normal. It's actually not that unusual. I'm sure you all have times like that. So it's just, what you go through. We had little layoffs here and there and things of that nature. I think the thing that was ultimately successful for us is we had a core team that was there together in the very early days. 5 or 6 of us that literally within the first couple of months of existence were together and stuck through all of it. And that was very, very helpful. I mean, when I kind of read about companies where founders break up or early people come and go quickly, a lot of that. I can imagine it's much harder. I had the good fortune of having a core group that was really there from the beginning and all the way through until I would just say we had proven the business was a real business, and that was the most fortunate. I don't think I couldn't say I accomplished that. I was just very fortunate to be in that situation. Any
other advice in retrospect for people slugging through when it feels dark?
Yeah, I mean, the sad thing is, I think, first of all, you just have to be the right person. You can't change who you are. But to be in this game, I think you have to be a person with an evenness to them. And not to say you can't react emotionally, get upset, get angry, but you have to be a person that knows how to bring yourself back to center really quickly, because you can't live in that world too long. You can't, in your company, be the one that's screaming and yelling or panicking or whatever. You have to be the sort of one that's always reasonably confident and moving forward. And I think that partially is something you're born with or you grow up with, so it's a little hard. But I think you can develop it as well. I mean, I personally had to find ways to just make sure the stress didn't build up and boil over. And for me, it ended up being getting up super early every morning. I was never a morning person. Started getting up at 5 in the morning. I would spend time just on myself, not quite meditation, just reading and quiet, and I would always work out, which for me, the history in sports, and just getting a workout every morning, getting up really early, it changed my life a lot. And I was probably halfway through this thing that I figured that out. And it's just something that means, no matter what happens one day, the next morning, generally, I'm fine. And by the way, you have to kind of observe yourself from the outside, if you will. One of the things I noticed is you can feel like in any moment of the day, this is incredible. We are unbeatable. And 2 hours later, this is a disaster. We are fucked. And literally nothing has changed in those 2 hours. I mean, a tiny little piece of something has changed, but everything else, facts on the ground, are the same. And if you can just recognize that, it's very powerful.
Let's talk about, you mentioned the team that's been together for a long time. Let's talk more about hiring, firing, evolving the team as you go through this roller coaster. What first comes to mind in terms of, for most of these people, the average company size is probably 15 people. So what should they be thinking about going from 15 to 50?
Yeah, I mean, getting your core team in place is really hard. I mean, if you're lucky, you have co-founders or really early people that can grow with you a bit. But invariably, you have to hire senior executives of finance or marketing or something like that. And that is like, it's a high-stakes business when you're doing that, because doing it wrong can be really problematic. And I'll say this, I would say hiring executives, which is just generally people that reported directly to me, I would say we had about a 50-50 success rate. And I actually think that's now pretty good, as much as that doesn't sound good. And I think if I did it over, I could probably maybe improve that a bit, but not much, because it's just extraordinarily difficult. Generally, if you're hiring people with a lot of experience, how that experience translates to your company is extraordinarily hard to know. And I will just, if there's only a couple of things I've learned is, number one, interviews are very limited in their usefulness or predictiveness. In fact, I would say probably the two best hires I made to report to me, one very recent, one about 5 years ago, I was very on the interview. If it wasn't for like others or my co-founder really saying, no, this is, I was just not, and I was completely wrong. These are stars. And conversely, certainly people that are just extremely good interviewers, you'll just be like, wow, that's great. And so I've just learned interviews are just, they're useful. I'm not saying don't do them, of course, but I think understanding someone's history and their references and things like that actually are far more predictive as to how well they do in your company. And the last thing I'll just say in this is never let an outside recruiter do references on your behalf, ever. I've done one of these very recently. Someone called me for a reference on somebody, and it was the recruiter, it was the hired recruiter. And it was somebody, honestly, I couldn't really recommend, to be honest. And I was like, look, if they ask the hard questions, I'm going to tell them what I need to tell them. I'm not going to lie here. They didn't ask anything resembling a hard question, and that person got the job, and bless him, hope he does well.
So how should you do references? How should these folks do references?
Yeah, references are so important. So first of all, whenever you're doing a reference, whether it's someone you found at sort of backdoor, which is always useful, you have to do it, of course, not in a way that's problematic, but, or even if it's someone that the candidate has given you, first make sure you understand their loyalty. Are they 100% loyal to that person, or maybe a little bit to you for some other reason? So understanding their loyalty. Even if they're 100% loyal to the candidate, you can get useful information, but you have to work very hard at it. I generally find that the best thing you can do, if they're loyal, I mean, they're not going to say anything bad about this person, right? Just realize that. But ask them neutral questions, right? So we just want to make sure that Joe is going to be successful here. So he could either be in this role where he's very sort of working on his own, very focused on a task, or really more, as part of a group. Which do you think Joe would gravitate towards more? Try to ask things that are neutral, or outside the company versus inside, or what have you, detail-oriented or hands-on versus. So if you do them in that way, you can just start to find something, and then you can pull a thread. And frankly, even the 100% loyal people, nobody wants to lie. So, I really like to say, would you hire this person again? Which, of course, they'll always say yes. But I think you'll say, are there situations where you might not hire this person again? And I think if you work hard, you can get really useful information.
Thinking about both the people on your team that work in the company and on the board, advisors, other investors, what's the right mix of people challenging, asking you hard questions, pushing back on things versus being supportive, doing what you ask them to do? How do you think about that?
I think inside the company, meaning the management team, you have to. For me, I'm all about speed of decision making. I've kind of written stuff about it. I think about it all the time, like how many times at bat you get, how quickly you do things. And I generally think it doesn't mean you have to be a dictator in making all decisions, but you have to facilitate a process that moves things very quickly. So I think my view would be a CEO. 96-7% of the time does not have to make the decision. They just have to facilitate the right decision on the right time frame with the right information. And there's only a handful of times where they just need to really say, this is what we're doing, and that's it. And usually when you do that moment where you grab the baton and say, this is what we're doing, people love it, even if they disagree with it, because something has gotten to a point where that needs to be done. So that's how I thought of it. With the board, it's very different. I mean, board members can be everything from like a no-op, just no effect on anything, they're just there, to someone who is trying to do your job for you, which is also really hard. I mean, they sort of like sometimes they just wish they were in management, or maybe they used to be, and but I think the very best board members do actually just pose very good questions. And sometimes they just force you to think about something a little differently or explain it in ways. And it is definitely the best of our board members have, caused us. That pivot I mentioned was really triggered by some very good questions. No one told me I had to pivot, just asked good questions, and it triggered the pivot in my mind.
Okay, speaking of questions, let's see if anyone in the audience has questions. Otherwise, I've got more. But anyone have any questions for Dave? Sure, go ahead.
On the management team, what were the trickiest? Which roles were the highest turnover out of your 50% success rate?
By far, Chief Marketing Officer. It's like it's a different job in every company. There's so many people with the title or the name or the history. It's one of these areas. I would put comms, like PR or whatever, in the same category where I honestly feel like there is a very modest number of complete rock stars that will do exactly what you want and be amazing, and there's an enormous number of people who will be a disaster. It's just weird. It's just a huge bifurcation of talent. And the talent may be specific to what you need, but it took us a few runs at it. And I will just say the lesson in there is when you get those things is if you make a mistake, and this is the thing I will take some credit for, when you make the mistake, undo it quickly. I had probably 4 over the course of our years, people hired directly to report to me that I let go within 3 months of hiring them. because it's just usually it becomes very obvious really quickly. It's and that's not a great thing for them. It's not a great thing for us, but in the end, it's much better than letting that thing run on for a long time.
With 50% turnover on executive teams, I can see that really impacting the team's morale. So do you recommend setting expectations with the team that it's likely that around 50% of people won't work out? Or?
No, it's really, actually our exec team has been crazily stable. What I really said was, it's not that we have 50% turnover, it's that 50% of a new hires will be successful and 50% were not. But we were fortunate in that probably, we were adding one a year or something like that. So we actually have an extremely stable team. I think if you don't have a stable executive team, I read about other companies where, the president, CFO, and the blah, blah, blah all left, and like, I don't know how companies like that survive. I've never had that. I've had the situations where, I hire a CMO and 3 months later unhire the CMO. So, but those are tough, In that case, by the way, what I really discovered was trying to bring somebody in who had all the right experiences. It turned out we had the right person in the company, but she was 28 years old. She'd come in 3 years prior as an individual contributor. We were a public company, and you'd go like, is this person really look by any things like what you would expect a public company to have as a CMO? Well, it turns out she was a rock star, and you just have to sort of acknowledge it and get beyond your bias that somebody that young, without a lot of management experience, et cetera, and very best win ever was placing the bet on the internal person.
Okay, I think we have time for one other question. Michael?
Hey, Dave. I'm a huge fan of your business. I have friends that moved all the way to Ohio to work for you, and they call it the best decision of their lives. But my question kind of goes to employee incentive, and you've seen your stock price go up and then go down, and working for and at a tech startup, the shareholder value and the upside is such a big part of recruiting. How have you been able to message that internally whilst you've seen this roller coaster?
Yeah, I mean, we went public at $20 a share 2.5 years ago. The stock for about 5 minutes hit like 390, right? I mean, realistically, it was like 100 to 200 for a lot of it. Went down to $12. It's now at 28. So, the obvious thing is you can't always fix that. At some point you have to reissue something, and if somebody can just walk out the door and have a 10 times better offer, that's a problem. Your board knows that, so you have to do things to fix it. But of course, like, you can't do it every 10 minutes, and because the stock drops another $10, you can't like redo it again. So generally speaking, the most important thing is people have to realize if they aren't there for the mission and they don't love the company and really want to be there for a long time, because the stock, if the company's good, the stock will work out fine in the long run. The person sitting next to you might be in a better position because of when they joined, et cetera. But ultimately, I do think it sounds trite, but they have to be there for the company, for the mission, with the appreciation that if we're doing the right things and we are a talented team, the stock will reflect that over time, and you'll be happy. But if you're just sort of a mercenary looking at the situation, there'll be times when you could say, yes, in my role, if I just took a new job. And that's problematic. One of the things we ended up doing, by the way, particularly when you're public, you can't just issue shares as you would like. There's a real sort of cap on how many shares you can issue. Is we moved entirely, this was sort of out of not having a lot of choice, to a 1-year stock grants. And that's what we do today, 1-year stock grants. And that basically, deals with a lot of the noise. And of course, it's a little, there's some trade-offs, of course, but we were sort of forced to do that because we had to keep people reasonably whole. But at the same time, we can't sort of fix everybody with 4-year grants. So.
Well, I will note in closing, as someone that was literally only an observer to the arc of Upstart, is it's really inspirational, because I can't really emphasize enough to all of you how things were dark. I mean, the initial business basically didn't work. And then the new business, which did work, it was a grind. And there were multiple times where it was not clear the company was going to be there in, maybe not in a week, but in a few quarters. And for me, I didn't realize the company's net cash positive. It's really warms my heart. But it's really inspirational because this is a company that's now generated value any way you look at it. And it was really hard for years. And just because it's hard doesn't mean, it can be that hard and still end up in a great place. So I think that's the takeaway message from this talk. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.